Now, quickly before I get into the video, if you could drop a like on it right now, that would be much appreciated. I just hit 10K, so thank you for that. I make content like this very regularly, pretty much daily at this point in time. And if you want to see more videos like this, just subscribing, dropping a like really helps. So that would be appreciated. Let's get into the video. I think we're always so fixated on what new signings are made by teams that we forget to praise teams for keeping their same core together. And although Toronto haven't kept the exact same core because they've lost Ibaka, they've lost Gasol, who are clearly important parts to their team. They kept VanVleet, which was very important. They needed to keep Freddie. They re-signed Chris Boucher, and then they signed probably the best center on the market after Ibaka went. I think a pretty good like-for-like replacement for Gasol, and that's Aaron Baines. Someone with a high IQ, someone that's won a championship before, someone that's been in a winning environment before, someone that just made a huge difference on the Suns. And you saw when DeAndre Ayton went down and he stepped up into the center position and stepped up as a starter, you saw that it was a pretty seamless transition for Phoenix, which is saying something considering one's the number 1 overall pick, the other's a 34-year-old out of Australia who went undrafted. But that's the kind of player Aaron Baines is, and that's the kind of player Toronto were looking for. And they got one. Someone that can splash threes, someone that can hit 9 threes a game against the Portland Trailblazers and drop 34 points. I believe that's his career high. I could be wrong. Aaron Baines fan club, please feel free to correct me if I am wrong. Someone who can do those kind of things, but also play make and fit into the Toronto environment, which involves moving the ball a lot, which involves being high IQ, especially at the center position, something Marc Gasol did so terrifically. And he's obviously a good defender as well, a good post defender, very similar type players. And I think at this stage in their career, you could argue Aaron Baines is an upgrade on Gasol. Now, they did lose Ibaka, but they re-signed Boucher. And Boucher is not Ibaka, but there's some kind of similarities in terms of he can stretch the floor a bit, in terms of his length, in terms of his defensive ability. And all of a sudden, Toronto look, I think, even better than before. I know Ibaka is a big loss, but when you look at their starting lineup, they've got 3 of their 5 starting lineup have improved every single year. There's not many teams in the league where you could say that, where you look at Siakam, you look at VanVleet, and you look at Anunoby, and all 3 of those guys have improved year on, year out. Even Lowry continues to get better somehow. And then you look at that kind of lineup that adds another piece that maintains their core together and has a very solid draft, in my opinion, as well, which we'll talk about. And I think Toronto aren't getting talked about enough because everyone seemed to think they'd just fall off a cliff, which has been the case for the last 2 years. They thought Lowry was going to leave last year. They thought the Raptors were going to go to 40 wins, 45 wins because of Kawhi leaving. No, they ended up the season as one of the top seeds. They ended up falling 1 game short of the Eastern Conference Finals. And considering how poorly their second, first best player, however you want to call Pascal Siakam, considering how badly he performed, to make it 1 game short of the Eastern Conference Finals, and then to see how close Boston and Miami were, it just shows that Toronto are really that close to being an NBA Finals kind of team. I know some people could see that as a reach, but when you look at 7-game series against Boston, and then Boston and Miami go head, and then Boston and Miami go toe-to-toe, and are a very close match, then one would argue, why wouldn't Miami and Toronto have been a close match as well? I think they're a team that has a great coach, that has a great defensive system, and has a great couple of star players in Lowry and Siakam. And I don't think enough people are talking about the moves they've made. Now let's start with the moves they made in the draft. With the 29th pick, they took Malachi Flynn, someone I was very high on, someone that's just a role player that you know is going to come in and provide an impact, a very Toronto kind of pick. Well, it's just a pick of a team that is very comfortable with their core and very comfortable with what they have going for them. So why try to take a swing on someone when you know you can bring in someone that they need at a position of need? They need a third point guard, and Malachi Flynn is like the perfect kind of guy to come in. Someone who thrives in the pick and roll, someone that can shoot from 3, someone who can get to the rim, someone that's a great playmaker, someone that's going to thrive in the pick and roll, most importantly. With another player they re-signed who got better and better in the pick and roll as the season went on, and that's Chris Boucher. Those two can have that dynamic that a lot of teams look for. We've seen it with Lou Williams and Montrezl Harrell, and we've seen how well that's worked. That's led to the Clippers overperforming in the playoffs and the regular season. Obviously not this year, but the year before. And the Raptors would be hoping to see some kind of chemistry develop between Flynn and Boucher because they're going to need that coming off the bench. They pride themselves on being a deep team with guys like Norman Powell, guys like Matt Thomas, Malachi Flynn will join that rotation, Chris Boucher. Those are guys that they all pride themselves on being solid rotation players, that they don't rely just on their starting 5 to get the job done. And if they can add someone to the mix straight out of the draft, that's exactly the kind of thing they would have been looking for. You can't say that the Toronto Raptors aren't going to be in the mix. and all the moves they're making suggest that they're going to continue to be just as good as last year, or even better in my opinion. You then even look at another guy they signed, Jalen Harris, with the 59th pick, and I didn't see much of him. I don't know much about him, but I know that a lot of the draft boards, a lot of the people that take the draft very seriously, had him as a high 40, low 50s kind of guy. So to get him at 59, I mean, it's only a slight steal, but it's still a steal. And when you consider all things about the Raptors organization, you just kind of assume those picks are going to work out, like I just do. And over the last few years, mostly they have worked. And Jalen Harris is a bit more of a flyer, someone that I think most people think of as more of an upside kind of guy, as opposed to Malachi Flynn, who's just going to have a really high kind of floor and then might not have the same kind of ceiling as other players in the draft that were around the 30 range. But he's going to have that really high floor that they wanted with the first round pick. And then Jalen Harris is more of a flyer, someone that might have that high upside. And that's kind of a guy they can stash away. Maybe he comes on, maybe he doesn't. But they don't need him to come on as much as they'd like Malachi Flynn to come on. So that's why I think it's important to note the difference in those two players. But getting back to free agency, yeah, sure, they didn't make a ton of moves, and sure, they could probably still do with some wing depth. They brought in Deandre Bembry, which, I mean, it's depth. I don't think he's a great player, but he does provide some kind of defense. And maybe Nick Nurse. If there's anyone that's going to get the best out of him, it's the Raptors and Nick Nurse. So I'll hold my judgments until I've seen him in a Raptors uniform, because that Raptors uniform does something kind of magical to a lot of players, particularly a lot of underperforming players. We've seen it before. Couldn't do it to Stanley Johnson. No one's been able to do that, but they've done it to a number of players. But apart from that, they got the center they needed in Aaron Baines. They lost Marc Gasol. Like I've said, kind of a like replacement. High IQ players, guys that aren't very athletic, guys that are old, but someone who can stretch the floor. Gasol wasn't really doing that, and that's important because Siakam is someone that they want to be able to get to the rim, something that he needs to be able to do when his three ball's not falling, like it just wasn't falling at all against Boston. So if he can get to the rim, if he has the space to get to the rim, which Aaron Baines will be spotting up from the three-point line a lot for Toronto, so if he has that opportunity to do so, that's just going to improve his performance and give him that second kind of option when his outside game isn't performing. And that's exactly what Toronto need, because they can't have another series where he's just absolutely awful, because no matter how good this team is as a whole, you need your star players, you need your all-star players to perform, and he didn't do that in the slightest. And then Boucher, Ibaka's clearly a huge loss, but we did see some big improvement from Boucher this year. They're going to hope that they see a huge leap next year, because they're going to need it to replace the production of Ibaka, which I don't think they're going to replace, obviously, but they're just going to hope other guys step up. They're going to hope going into the playoffs next year, Siakam has a better series, which is just hard to imagine he doesn't. He's someone that's improved every year. He's someone that knows he was terrible in the playoffs. He's someone that I'm assuming is going to work on his game and get even better. You've got OG Anunoby, who I think has another gear to go to. Even Fred VanVleet, I think, can go a higher level. He's got that Kyle Lowry kind of mold. Kyle Lowry's an all-star kind of guy. Kyle Lowry's one of the top 6 point guards in the NBA, in my opinion. And who's to say Fred VanVleet can't get to that kind of level? And if he does as soon as next year, you take a big leap from OG, and then Pascal gets back to his best in the playoffs. Baines continues to be Splash Mountain from beyond the arc. I'm telling you, why is this team not in contention for another championship? They had to address a third point guard in the drafts. They did it. They got probably the best kind of backup point guard, kind of off the bench guy I think there is in the draft, one of the most NBA ready prospects they could get. They needed that. They did it. They needed to get a center. They got the best one on the market, in my opinion. They needed to get a backup center once they lost Ibaka. They re-signed Boucher, who's improved year on and year out. And then they needed to keep Freddie. They did so. They had a good draft. They had a good free agency. Sure, they lost Ibaka. I'm not too worried about the Gasol loss, because I think Baines is a like-for-like replacement, if not better at this stage in their career. But Ibaka's a big loss, but then you factor in what they did in the draft and what they did in free agency, keeping Freddie and making the kind of moves that you would have hoped they'd make. And I think they can just make up for it with players taking another step next year, which I'd hope OG does, because he's the guy that can be their X-Factor kind of guy going into next year, and I hope he really takes that next leap. The Raptors didn't do anything crazy, but they just didn't need to do anything crazy. Another thing to note is they've got two players. The two players they signed in Boucher and Baines have team options for next year, not player options, team options, which is important to note because we know how stacked free agency is next year. But going into next free agency, I mean, they'd love to be able to pick up someone like Giannis. I mean, who wouldn't? They'd love to be able to pick up a number of those kind of 2021 free agents that would help their team go to the next level. So to have that flexibility with Baines and with Boucher, it suggests they're really going to take a swing at next year's free agency, because it was a reason that I think Ibaka left, according to reports. He wanted that second year guaranteed. Toronto didn't want to give it to him, and they got in two players that now have team options, and they now have the potential to go out next year and sign a big free agent, which is another big win in my opinion. Flexibility. Masai Ujiri can pull off moves that we've seen before, so to have that flexibility heading into the best free agency class in a long time is a big move that they made this year that's going to benefit them next year. And that's important to know. They're a team that's going to be knocking on the door for the Eastern Conference Finals, the NBA Finals again next year. And the fact that no one's really talking about them is kind of crazy in my opinion. So I think that's why I had something to say. And I think that's what I wanted to say. Basically, the Raptors are a team that you just shouldn't sleep on. We've seen that be a mistake before. The last 2 years, people have slept on them. And obviously that hasn't really worked out well for those kind of guys sleeping on them. And I don't think next year is going to be the year to sleep on them either, because I think they're going to continue to be great. They're going to continue to be very good. And the moves they have made suggest no otherwise. Now, if you did make it all the way to the end of the video, consider dropping a like, consider subbing to the channel. Other than that, I'll catch you next time. Bye.